So the presidential fitness test was around for a long time, several decades, 50 years-ish. And then President Obama changed it. And instead of having it be so competitive, the goal was to have it be more of an individual improvement thing. And now, I guess a decade or so on after that, President Trump is reinstating the old school presidential fitness challenge. That's the short version. Dante, tell me the details. What is going on?
The original test came from a study done by Krauss and Weber. It was actually called the Krauss-Weber test.
Okay.
And it was more of an assessment, so it looked at, I don't know, basically flexibility in kids, essentially. There wasn't a really demanding physical kind of performance aspect to this.
Strength element.
Yeah. But this was in the 50s, and there were about 4,000 subjects in the study. And what they found was that the kids in the United States performed much worse than the kids in Europe.
Oh.
So I think it was something like 8% of kids in Europe, 8 or 9%, had a passing, or excuse me, only 8 or 9% of those kids failed, whereas there was some astronomical number in the American population that I think it was like about over 50% of American children failed at least one of the minimum tests that were essentially just trying to look at strength and flexibility. So the test that eventually came from that it's not the same test, which is, critical to distinguish.
Yep.
But this was, you think about the era that the United States and the rest of the world was in at that time. This fitness gap was almost like a sign of a national weakness.
Yeah.
And a threat to compete against the national powers at the time. This was the Cold War era. The Soviet Union, tensions were high, and America was falling behind in the Olympic medal race. So there was a lot here versus just, hey, we're concerned about this looming obesity crisis and we're concerned about all these chronic diseases. No, this was more of like hey, we need to be able to puff our chest out in this next wave of kids. If they're failing this test, that's theoretically the next wave of soldiers that we might need in a military setting and, all that sort of thing. That was at least my kind of interpretation of maybe the sentiment at the time.
And the draft was still a thing at the time. And this would have been relatively early in the US as the ultimate superpower. Obviously the Cold War is the big stand. That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that element of it. Okay.
Not to go into too much detail on the Krauss-Weber test, but this test that was used in that original study that scared everybody in America, all the test was a sit-up with straight legs, sit-up with bent knees, leg raises with straight legs, upper body lift, lower body lift, and a forward bend to basically test the flexibility in your, in your hips and in your hamstrings.
So just a single one of each of those.
I mean, this was like basically, I don't know if it was 10 seconds or you had to reach 10 inches or what the specific metrics were, but by all accounts, I mean, this is very, very basic testing. So sure, for people to receive failing grades on these,
that would be
concerning.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I don't know. What if you took these same kids and, they did some of the running components instead.
Yep.
There were kids playing sports and there were other things going on that maybe these tests, I mean, these are like flexibility tests, really. I just, looking at how current assessments are done and even how the test has evolved, it just kind of makes you wonder that maybe we gave this a little too much credence. I think a change needed to be made.
Sure.
But it was like, oh my goodness, this is so bad. And it was very, very basic.
So the test stays more or less the same for the next few decades. And then in 2012, President Obama overhauled or radically changed the way that this was done. What happened then?
So there was a huge shift, again, maybe back to some of the Eisenhower sentiment, I think, that gets glossed over in a lot of what I've read. And this was essentially just something that adopted a more holistic, health-focused, and less competitive approach, as Joey basically alluded to. So what they ultimately did was establish another test, which is what I know as the fitness gram. And with the fitness gram, this was the initiative that the Obama administration put forth was that we get this, we don't force all the schools to adopt this, is what I understood, but we get it out there to as many as possible. The goal was to have like 50,000 schools, nationwide, switch over to a program like this. And I think, again, I was too young to really to feel what this was like. But in looking at the actual aspects of the test, like it's still, you can't get away from testing a physical, characteristic, if you will. So they, instead of doing a 50-yard sprint or a 600-yard test, there was something that most people know as like a meme at this point, and that's the pacer test.
Okay.
Or the fitness gram beep test. And so this is where you run back and forth. A lot of sports teams even, implemented this, and the beep gets shorter each time. So it beeps, you run, and then once you get to the other side, you wait for the next beep, then you run to the other side. So it's about 20 meters, and the beeps get closer in duration. And if you're past a certain, if you make it a certain amount of lengths on the course or whatever, then that constitutes a higher level of aerobic capacity. Okay. Or they also used to look at the 1 mile run, which I do remember doing in gym class. And they also had walking tests, I think, to be able to meet students where they stand.
Were, sure.
They still did the sit and reach, which I remember stuck around. And then there was also some sort of shoulder stretch that measured flexibility in the shoulder joint. So again, with looking at how much or how little a student needs as far as physical activity, you can't really avoid some sort of test, right? I mean, even if we look at what VO2 max, shows and corresponds to, it's still VO2 max is not like a blood sample,
right,
that you just see.
Yeah.
It's something that is correlated with a physical performance. And so it's just inherent that there will still be some gamification or performance aspect to these tests. It is just unavoidable. Now, in the original era, we'll call it, the pre-Obama initiative, it seemed as though there was unless you had like a really good gym teacher or a really good curriculum, or you were just lucky, there was very little follow-up with what was done with these tests.
That is my memory. Absolutely.
So, so you just, again, there was standardization. You're the 90th percentile, and here's your ribbon. Like, here's your ribbon, or your 95th percentile. There's your patch. And you just wore it with a badge of honor, like you arrived. You know what I mean? And if you were somebody who wasn't fortunate enough to receive that, there wasn't necessarily this push to involve your parents or your guardians or whatever the case to begin to build upon these characteristics. I mean, these are not fixed characteristics that they were testing, right? It's running and pushing and pulling, and sure, there are certain people who are going to be better or worse at a given test. But this was not like the final say in your physical capability. So kids doing the test in those eras, they were done a disservice as far as the lack of follow-up went. And my understanding with the fitness gram era, we'll call it the beep test era, is that at least there were tests and retests. And I believe that if there was areas of concern, that this was more brought to the parents' attention, and there were things that the parents could then collaborate with the teachers to begin to improve those tests.
Okay, so theoretically, creating a pathway forward, a way to improve these things for the kids, so that there's follow through, like you said. That makes a lot of sense.
Exactly. The other thing that's important to mention with like the Obama era, I guess we'll call it, physical activity programs, were that it was multifaceted. This wasn't like, hey, we're just going to like hang our hat on this gold standard test. This test or this fitness gram or these components of the test, they're one small piece within this whole, picture of things we're actually concerned about. Because now at this point, we're concerned with the, rising rates of obesity, rising rates of early onset diabetes and type 2 diabetes later in life, all these things that were beginning to run, at all time highs, what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so this was marked a shift in the foods that were in schools and after school programs, and not just this test and gym class. And while the PE curriculum is essential, because you have kids at school, that wasn't the end all be all.
Right.
They did their best to implement things that allowed kids to get up and moving during school and so on and so forth. But again, as we look at the kind of where we stand today, as far as those obesity rates and, higher rates of chronic disease that are largely, preventable chronic diseases, and also the levels of activity that we're actually doing into adulthood,
right,
we know that we still have not been able to get a grip on those things. And to me, it doesn't really reflect a failure per se of Kennedy's era, or a failure of Eisenhower's sentiment, or a failure of Obama's era per se. It doesn't really seem like any of those things move the needle on what's happening, because the issue is so big and so complex, and it's much bigger. I'm not reinventing the wheel here, but it's much bigger than just this baseline test that, 6 and 16-year-olds are being given in school. This is a tiny sliver between all of that. But again, it just boils down to the issue is, what kind of seeds are we planting with kids in gym class at impressionable ages,